Have you ever noticed how some people work nonstop, yet still feel stuck, while others seem to move ahead with half the effort? They wake up earlier than everyone else. They sleep later. They sacrifice weekends, rest, and peace of mind. And still, the results don't come. Promotions pass them by. Progress feels slow. Life feels heavy. If that sounds familiar, this video is for you. Most of us were taught one powerful idea growing up: work harder and you will succeed. So when things don't work out, we don't question the idea. We question ourselves. We push more. We grind harder. We tell ourselves we are not doing enough. And slowly, exhaustion becomes normal. Burnout becomes routine. Struggle becomes a badge of honor. But what if the problem isn't that you're lazy? What if the problem isn't your discipline? What if the real reason you're failing is because hard work alone is not the answer? Today, I'm going to share a simple story that changes how you look at effort, success, and productivity. It's not about shortcuts. It's not about luck. It's about a lesson most people learn too late, after years of unnecessary suffering. If you stay with me until the end, you'll walk away with a mental shift that can save you years of burnout and help you work smarter, not just harder. Because sometimes, the reason you're tired isn't that you're weak. It's because you've been using the wrong strategy. Daniel was 32 years old, and he believed in one rule above all others: hard work never lies. He lived in a quiet farming valley where land was passed down through generations, and his small farm had once belonged to his father. To Daniel, this land wasn't just soil and crops. It was proof of character. And character, he believed, was built through struggle. Every morning, long before the sun touched the fields, Daniel was already awake. 4 a.m. became his normal. He worked with his bare hands, refusing modern tools because he believed they made people weak. He planted each seed manually. He watered every row with heavy buckets. He pulled weeds one by one. From sunrise to sunset, his body never stopped moving. His hands were cracked and bleeding. His back ached constantly. But Daniel felt proud of that pain. To him, exhaustion meant honesty. It meant effort. It meant he was doing things the right way. At night, when his body finally gave up, he would collapse into bed with barely enough energy to eat. He rarely spoke. He rarely smiled. And he almost never noticed the worried look in his wife Emily's eyes as she watched him slowly disappear into his work. Emily tried to warn him. She would tell him he was pushing too hard. That there had to be a better way. That working more hours wasn't fixing their problems. But Daniel always answered the same way. Success requires sacrifice. Hard work never fails. If things aren't improving, it just means I need to work harder. The neighbors admired him. Some even pitied him. They said Daniel worked like 3 men combined. And if effort alone created success, he would have been rich. But reality told a different story. Despite all the hours, all the pain, and all the sacrifice, his farm barely survived. Each harvest was stressful. Debt followed every season. And no matter how much he pushed himself, the results stayed average. Daniel had no time, no energy, and no life outside his work. He was always moving, always busy, always exhausted. Yet somehow, he was still falling behind. And that's when something began to quietly haunt him. Because right next to his struggling farm was someone who lived by very different rules. Right next to Daniel's land lived a man named Mark. He was the same age. He owned a farm of almost the same size. And in the beginning, he had even less money than Daniel did. On paper, there was no reason Mark should be doing better. But reality told a different story. Mark started his day at 8 in the morning, not 4. He finished by early afternoon. 6 hours of work, sometimes less. In the evenings, he rested. He read. He spent time with his family. While Daniel was still dragging himself through the fields, Mark was already done for the day. And yet, Mark's farm produced nearly twice as much. This fact ate away at Daniel's mind. He tried not to think about it, but it followed him everywhere. At night, in the early mornings, during the long hours of labor. How could someone who worked half the time earn double the results? Mark used modern systems, efficient irrigation, simple tools that saved time and energy. During harvest season, he hired part-time help instead of exhausting himself. And because his body and mind were not constantly drained, he made better decisions. He planned. He adjusted. He improved. Daniel noticed everything. And he hated it. Not because Mark was lazy. Not because Mark cheated. But because Mark's success challenged the belief Daniel had built his entire life around. If hard work was the answer, then Mark shouldn't be winning. But he was. Daniel told himself there had to be a reason. Luck. Timing. Maybe even unfair advantage. Anything was easier to accept than the thought that he might be wrong. Then the summer came. And with it, the drought that pushed Daniel past his limit. That summer, the valley dried out faster than anyone expected. The heat was brutal. Rain stopped coming. And water became the most valuable thing every farmer had. Everyone faced the same problem, but Daniel responded the only way he knew how. He worked harder. Instead of waking up at 4, he woke up at 3. He walked long distances to a distant well and carried heavy buckets back to his fields. Over and over again. 50 trips a day. His shoulders burned. His legs shook. His body begged him to stop, but his mind refused to listen. He kept repeating the same words like a promise. Hard work never fails. While Daniel destroyed himself one bucket at a time, Mark quietly adjusted his irrigation system. He watered his crops during cooler hours. He reduced waste. He let the system do the heavy work while he monitored and planned. Day after day, Daniel pushed through pain that no one could see. His vision blurred. His heart raced. His hands trembled. But he refused to slow down. Stopping felt like failure. On the 15th day of this routine, his body made the decision for him. While carrying another bucket of water, Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him. His sight faded. His grip loosened. The bucket slipped from his hands, spilling water into the dust. Then his legs gave out. He collapsed between the rows of his crops, gasping for air, his heart pounding out of rhythm. He couldn't stand. He couldn't shout. All he could do was lie there, surrounded by the work that was slowly killing him. Emily found him like that. The doctor was direct and unforgiving. Daniel was dehydrated, severely exhausted, sleep-deprived, and dangerously close to a heart attack. If he continued this way, the next harvest wouldn't matter. He wouldn't live to see it. That night, lying in a hospital bed, Daniel stared at the ceiling and felt something new. Not anger, not frustration, but defeat. Not defeat from the drought. Not defeat from bad luck, but defeat from the realization that everything he believed about success might be wrong. And that question refused to let him sleep. Lying in that hospital bed, Daniel couldn't escape his thoughts. The machines hummed softly around him, but his mind was louder than any sound in the room. For the first time in his life, he wasn't exhausted from work. He was exhausted from confusion. He had done everything he was told to do. He had worked longer hours than anyone around him. He had sacrificed rest, comfort, and time with the people he loved. And still, he was failing. When Emily sat beside him and held his hand, Daniel finally said the words he had been afraid to admit. He asked her, almost in a whisper, why his effort wasn't enough. Why all that suffering had led him here instead of forward. Emily didn't argue. She didn't criticize him. She simply looked at him and said something that stayed with him long after she left that night. Maybe hard work isn't the answer. Maybe there's something you haven't learned yet. That sentence hit harder than any physical pain he had felt in the fields. 3 days later, when Daniel was strong enough to walk again, he made a decision that went against his pride. He walked to Mark's house. For years, he had silently judged him. Now, he needed him. Mark opened the door with a look of genuine concern. He had heard about the collapse. He invited Daniel in without hesitation. They sat on the porch, looking out over Mark's healthy, green fields. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Daniel spoke slowly. For the first time, there was no confidence in his voice. He told Mark he didn't understand. He worked twice as hard. He put in twice the hours. And yet Mark's results were better in every way. Mark didn't answer right away. He stood up instead and asked Daniel to follow him. There was something he wanted to show him. And in that moment, Daniel didn't realize it yet, but the belief that had ruled his entire life was about to be broken. Mark led Daniel to a small tool shed at the edge of the field. Inside, the air smelled of wood and metal. Mark reached into a corner and pulled out 2 axes. One was old, worn, and dull. The other was sharp, clean, and well cared for. He handed Daniel the dull axe and pointed to a thick log nearby. He asked him to try. Daniel swung. The blade barely scratched the surface. He swung again. And again. Each strike sent a jolt through his arms, but the log barely changed. After several swings, Daniel was breathing hard, sweat running down his face, and the wood still stood firm. Then Mark picked up the sharp axe. One swing cut deep. A second followed. Then a third. Within moments, the log split clean in half. Mark looked at Daniel and asked him to imagine 2 men cutting trees. The first swings his axe all day without stopping. He believes effort alone will win. The second works fewer hours, but every hour he stops to sharpen his blade. The first man laughs at him. He calls him lazy. He tells him to stop wasting time and keep swinging. But by the end of the day, the second man has cut down twice as many trees. Mark turned back to Daniel and spoke calmly. You are not weak. You are not lazy. You have simply been swinging a dull axe for years, wondering why your hands are bleeding while the tree refuses to fall. Daniel stood there in silence. The message was painfully clear. For the first time, he saw his own life in that log. All the effort. All the pain. And very little progress. Mark placed the axe down and told him something Daniel would never forget. There is a difference between being busy and making progress. Between motion and results. And then Mark did something even more important. He began to explain how to sharpen the axe. Mark didn't speak like a teacher. He spoke like someone who had made the same mistakes and learned the hard way. He told Daniel that success wasn't about avoiding hard work. It was about directing it. First, he explained the idea of systems over effort. He showed Daniel how water reached his crops through simple irrigation lines.
No buckets. No wasted motion.
The system worked while he slept. Mark told him that one smart system could replace hours of physical pain. Money spent once saved time every day. Daniel realized he had been trading his health for tasks a simple setup could handle. Second, Mark talked about focus over hustle. He explained that he grew only 2 types of crops. Crops that matched the soil. Crops that sold well. Daniel, on the other hand, was trying to grow too many things at once. His attention was split. His results were average everywhere. Mark told him that mastery in a few things beats mediocrity in many. Doing less, but doing it better, changed everything. Third, Mark spoke about rest as part of the strategy. He said tired people make bad decisions. Exhausted minds miss problems and ignore opportunities. Rest wasn't laziness. It was fuel. Because when the mind is clear, work becomes sharper. Daniel finally understood why Mark could plan, adjust, and improve while he was always reacting. Mark placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder and said something simple but powerful. You don't fail because you don't work hard enough. You fail because hard work is the only tool you use. That evening, Daniel walked home with a heavy mind, but for the first time in years, his heart felt light. He didn't rush to the fields. He sat down with Emily and told her he was ready to think differently. For the first time, Daniel wasn't planning to work harder. He was planning to work smarter. The next morning, Daniel did something that would have once made him feel guilty. He stopped working early. After just a few hours in the fields, he put his tools down and sat at the table with a notebook. Instead of pushing his body, he chose to use his mind. He researched irrigation systems. He visited the local agricultural office. He spoke to suppliers. For the first time, he planned before acting. Within 2 weeks, Daniel sold old equipment he barely used and invested in a simple irrigation setup. Installing it took a few days, but once it was running, something unbelievable happened. A task that used to steal 6 hours of his day now took less than 20 minutes. Daniel used the extra time differently. He studied his soil. He analyzed which crops actually made money. He reduced his focus from many crops to just 2 that thrived in his land. Instead of being average at everything, he became excellent at a few things that mattered. During peak season, he hired help instead of destroying himself. Paying someone fairly for a few hours saved him days of exhaustion. 1 hour of planning began to produce more value than 10 hours of blind labor ever had. But the biggest change wasn't in the fields. Daniel had dinner with Emily again. They talked. They laughed. He slept better. He exercised in the mornings and noticed his focus improve. His body grew stronger, and his mind grew clearer. People began to notice. They told him he looked healthier, calmer, and more confident. Daniel didn't argue. He simply smiled and said something that would have once sounded impossible to him. I'm working less, but I'm getting more done. And for the first time in years, that statement was true. 6 months later, the next harvest arrived. Daniel walked through his fields with a quiet confidence he had never felt before. The crops were healthier. The rows were fuller. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what the numbers would say. When the harvest was complete, the results were undeniable. His farm produced more than it ever had before. Not by a small margin, but by nearly 40%. And this time, it didn't come from longer days or broken sleep. It came from focus, planning, and clear decisions. Daniel was working 7 hours a day instead of 15. Yet those 7 hours created more value than his longest days ever had. Every task had a purpose. Every effort moved him forward. Mark visited one evening and walked the land with him. He nodded with approval and told Daniel he had learned the lesson most people never do. Daniel thanked him, not just for the advice, but for showing him another way to build something meaningful. But Daniel knew the truth went beyond farming. Because his story wasn't about crops or land. It was about a belief that traps millions of people. The belief that pain equals progress. That exhaustion proves worth. That suffering is the price of success. And that belief is wrong. Hard work is important, but it is not enough. The people who move ahead aren't always the ones who work the longest. They are the ones who think clearly, build systems, and protect their energy. Before you work harder, ask yourself if there's a smarter way. Before you add more hours, ask if focus could do more. And before you sacrifice your health, remember this. You are not a machine designed to run until it breaks. You are a human with the ability to create leverage. Before this video ends, I want you to pause for a moment and look at your own life. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Right now. Think about the task that drains most of your energy. The one you spend the most time on. The one that leaves you exhausted but doesn't move you forward the way you hoped. Now ask yourself a different question. Is there a smarter way to do this? Could a system replace effort? Could a tool save time? Could focus on fewer things create better results? Could rest help you think more clearly instead of pushing blindly? Daniel's biggest breakthrough didn't come from working harder. It came from stopping long enough to think. One afternoon of planning changed the direction of his entire life. And the same is possible for you. So here's your challenge. Take one afternoon this week. Just one. Not to grind. Not to hustle. But to design a better system. Optimize one task. Improve one process. Sharpen one dull axe. Because the truth is simple. Your best work will never come from exhaustion. It comes from clarity, strategy, and a rested mind. If this story connected with you, share it with someone who is pushing themselves too hard. Someone who thinks suffering is the only path forward. And if you want more stories like this, stories that change how you think about success, stay connected. Remember this one thing. Stop swinging the dull axe. It's time to sharpen it.